My name is Chris. I work for the Grand Canyon Conservancy Field Institute. I'm here with Jack from the Glen Canyon Institute, and he's going to talk a little bit about Glen Canyon. So, Jack, take it away.
Hi, everybody. My name's Jack. I'm the outreach director here at Glen Canyon Institute. We're based in Salt Lake City, but our nonprofit is a 26-year-old science-based advocacy group that focuses on the Glen Canyon region on the Colorado Plateau. And we do basically science-based advocacy to help fight for a restored Glen Canyon, a free-flowing Colorado River through both Glen and Grand Canyon. So I've got a little slideshow I'm going to show you all about that and get more into the nitty-gritty details of the history of our work and kind of the future of the river and Glen Canyon from our perspective. So yeah, like I was saying, Glen Canyon Institute was founded in 1996, and our stated mission is to fight for a free-flowing Colorado River through both Glen and Grand Canyon. And we basically work on this through partnerships with research institutions, other nonprofits, and different groups throughout the plateau to fight for science that helps steer the ship that fights for a more holistic way of kind of viewing and understanding the water in the Southwest pertaining to the Colorado River. Over the course of the last 25 years, we've had a huge variety of support and kind of framework around this, but recently, because of low water, a lot of new traction has come along, and we've actually seen a lot of these processes start to really take shape. So we've done a lot of work in the past, kind of building this system of understanding how we can restore Glen Canyon, and now it's becoming kind of more realistic than it ever has been in the past century or so. So this is, I wouldn't say boring, but it's definitely the kind of drier part of the Colorado River dialogue here, but it's really important to understand like kind of how we got to where we are now. So basically the way the river is split up comes from this prior appropriation doctrine. So the way it works is whoever was using the water first gets a bigger share of the river. So back in the 1800s, when California was the first state kind of using a lot of the river, they were kind of the first place that people were given water rights. So they put it to beneficial use, and that kind of like set the ball rolling for the rest of the basin states to start taking claims to the river thereafter. So basically California and Arizona started using water before Colorado, Nevada, and Utah. So once those states started to grow, they started seeing that they needed also to stake their claim in the Colorado River. So we have this law that kind of guides that way that each state takes little pieces of their share. And this law is called the Colorado River Compact, which was signed in 1922 by all of these states. And over the last many years, this has changed slightly. Well, not slightly, it's changed a lot over the last 100 years. And now we kind of call the whole piece of legislation, which has different lines depending on the changes they made, called the Law of the River. And it takes the assumption that there's 16.5 million acre feet in the Colorado River, and it splits it up between these different states and countries have the share. So as you can see, there's 7 basin states and 2 countries that rely on this, as well as some 30 Native American tribes. And this is the amount of water that they delegate. And like going back to a couple of slides ago, each one of these states gets a different share of that depending on their prior appropriation. And here is the full kind of appropriation here. As you can see, California kind of gets the lion's share of water, and then each other state is kind of delegated their own. And you can see the basin here as well. So you guys are all probably pretty familiar with this picture and the way the system works. But this is definitely a nice kind of overview of the Colorado Plateau and the different states and tributaries that are part of this piece of land that we're talking about. And then Glen Canyon, of course, is sort of right at the border here between Arizona and Utah, Glen Canyon Dam, sort of right there on the state line. And that's where we delineate the upper and lower basins. So Glen Canyon above that, Grand Canyon below. And that spot is where the upper and basin split, and these different states kind of have control over the different appropriation or allotments of water that they get. And so that's really why we have Glen Canyon Dam to begin with. The goal of Glen Canyon Dam, for the sake of the upper basin states, was to take control of their allotment of the river. So instead of just letting all the water go downstream to Mead into the lower basin, they wanted to have a backup, like a safeguard, to keep their water stored upriver, so they could basically control their allotment versus having the lower basin states control it for them. And there's, it's interesting because a lot of people consider Glen Canyon Dam and Lake Powell as this place where people are using a lot of water, where the upper basin states are using their allotment. But in reality, it's just a bank account. So it's just this reservoir that sits there, allows for the upper basin to feed their water downstream versus letting it all go at once. So these are kind of how it happened here. It was commissioned in 1956 under the Colorado River Storage Project Act, and completed in 1963, which is when they kind of closed the gates in the dam and let the reservoir, Lake Powell, start to back up. This was done before a lot of the environmental processes that we have in place now, a lot of the federal laws that help understand why big projects like this might be more invasive than we want in landscapes. So it was done before all of that. It's basically one of two reservoirs that allow for the ability to control Colorado River water. So to many people, it was kind of maybe the biggest loss of all in terms of modern environmental fights. So it kind of kicked off the environmental movement in a lot of ways. It sort of rallied people around a single cause of trying to protect landscapes that otherwise didn't have a voice. Lots of folks considered Glen Canyon to be, more beautiful than any other part of the river, and a potential great national park. There it is, Segner saying it. So yeah, it was a really special place to river runners, to photographers, to artists, writers, and singers, and just a really serene landscape compared to Cataract upstream and Grand Canyon downstream. It was a really mellow section of the river, so kind of a reprieve from the wild rapids that we see above and below it. Yeah, just some really beautiful glens, hence the name, but lots of arches and slot canyons, and kind of each little side canyon has its own little tributary, a little free flowing creek through it. So lots of free flowing water for riparian areas. Really beautiful place. And of course, when they commissioned the dam be built, they said no one lived there, which of course we now know, and even at the time knew to not be true. It's an ancestral home of the Paiute Native American tribes, and they would take care of seeps and springs in these side canyons. They would farm, and they lived there. And it's also very culturally significant to the Navajo people. It's something that of course was overlooked because they didn't have any of these kind of methods in place to help facilitate conversations from the tribes. And it's really a great tragedy that they just did this salvage project versus actually conferring with people that had lived in this place for millennia. So it's kind of hard to overstate or understate the amount of damage that the dam has done to parts of the desert that were, I've kind of been talking about, side canyons and tributaries and just beautiful, serene places. But backed up 290 river miles. Now decades of sediment load have been trapped in different parts of the reservoir. And when they did this salvage project for the Native Americans, they identified 3,500 cultural sites, but of course there were probably a lot more than that. There's also these side canyons and tributary canyons. So the Escalante, the Dirty Devil, the San Juan. These are other, amazing river sections that had a fair amount of reservoir backed up into them at high water. And I'll talk a bit more about those later on because that's where a lot of our research is taking place now. But for a long time, it was conceived that these were, now reservoir and kind of these sections of river were lost, which was very sad. So yeah, this is, of course, downstream in Grand Canyon, we see huge impacts from the dam as well. As I'm sure you all know, when you put in for the Grand Canyon, it's, cold and clear water, which is highly unnatural for that part of the world. And you don't really get a sediment load until you're below the confluence or, places where sediment are able to access it, which has been damaging for a number of reasons, but for the sake of native fish population, erosion of beaches, and just the landscape itself changing in a kind of unnatural way. Being able to mitigate that by moving sediment downstream, putting sediment back into the Grand Canyon where it belongs is kind of one of our big fights for having a more kind of holistic ecosystem between the interaction of the two canyons. And yeah, once again, I'm sure you all know these fish here, but the threatened and endangered fish on the Colorado River, the 4 endemic species that have evolved and thrived in this river system for a long time. So they're really, really cool fish. And I've been fortunate enough to go on the river with some fish biologists who, have been really excited about the uplisting of the humpback chub. And hopefully in future years, we'll be able to see more resilience in these species as more habitat comes back. Here they are. So things are, as I'm sure you've all seen in the news and just from your experience on the plateau and in the river system, things are rapidly changing. It's been pretty, we sort of known all along that, especially since the early 2000s when we saw what could happen so quickly, we sort of knew that it was just a matter of time until the nature showed us that having 2 giant reservoirs in the Southwest wasn't a sustainable way to move forward. And as it is today, Lake Powell is sitting at about 26% full, which is almost 170 feet below full pool. Official shortages have been called on Lake Mead, and there's a pretty significant chance that we're going to lose Glen Canyon Dam hydropower in the coming year, which is pretty shocking. And 2 years ago, people would have still were saying that, we're crazy for this idea, but we now know that it's really just a matter of time until nature does this without even Glen Canyon Institute being here. But our goal is to help people understand what the reality is and steward the conversation versus just hitting these crises points and not knowing what to do. So this is like going back to kind of the beginning of this with the allocation process here. So we think that there's 16.4 million acre feet in the river, which is what we've delegated to all the states and Mexico. Realistically, the 100-year mean flow is actually closer to 14.76 million acre feet. And in this kind of more recent millennial drought, or we're calling more just long-term aridification of the region in the last 20 years, we've had 12 million acre feet. And then 2021 flow, when stuff really dropped, we had 3 million acre feet inflow into Powell. And that's, 25% of average, which is kind of crazy because we had like relatively good snow years. And so the fact that just the aridification of the area itself takes down that much flow is pretty shocking. And to see what that does to the reservoir is in just a year or two is pretty amazingly kind of scary, but it's also interesting for a lot of reasons. So yeah, this is interesting because it goes back to this prior appropriation idea that we have a certain amount of water for everybody to use, which was based off of, bad numbers and it's not realistic anymore. So it's important to remember that, we've over allocated this river. And so because of growing populations and climate change and just the over allocation, we've basically just push this resource to its complete maximum. We're over that, really. I mean, we're past maximum. So climate change is really one of the driving factors here of what's happening. So thinking about Lake Powell's inflow in 2021, the heating Southwest and just kind of more sporadic and less predictable precipitation has really just created this environment where we don't get the inflows that we used to. So it's already reduced flows by 13% and projected to decrease by another 20% by 2050 and 35% by 2021. It's really just the new normal of the region. We're dealing with a hotter and drier Southwest. And yeah, that coupled with the overallocation itself is kind of pushing this resource to the brink. So it's very interesting to keep tabs on what's happening month over month with the warming, drying, and more unpredictable precipitation. And so, yeah, this just expands upon that in terms of the inefficient runoff. So what happens here, as you can see, in 2021, we had 85% of average, but only 25% of runoff. In 2020, we had 105% average snowpack and only 50% runoff. And so basically, we have just a drier ground. So when the snowfall happens, we have snowpack and it starts to melt. More of that snowpack is lost to the environment than actually getting down to the river. We also have increased evapotranspiration, and then of course dust on snow, which is creating a whole set of problems with snow melt. So average snowpack no longer guarantees an average runoff. We cannot rely on that. Even when we get these big winters or even normal winters, we don't get normal or what they perceived as normal runoff. So yeah, this is kind of where we're at right now. We've had, several years, almost 20 years of really up and down fluctuations in the reservoirs, but we really don't have the we don't have the need for two giant reservoirs, considering how much water is in each one of them. So as you can see here, we have not even enough water to fill one Lake Powell or Lake Mead. I think there'll be another slide about this, but basically right now Powell, like I said earlier, is at below 30%. So it's like 26% full and 168 feet below full pool. So what we have kind of come up with to, I wouldn't say solve this problem, but to get in front of the problem and to think of a new path forward for the river and these regions is our kind of umbrella project called Fill Mead First. So we started to develop this about a decade into the millennial drought. And when we started to see like what was really happening with this, some of these processes like overallocation and climate change, we sort of started to think like, okay, so what can we really do to change this paradigm? And the idea is that we would take upper basin state water in Lake Powell and move it downstream to Lake Mead. This would have a variety of different positive impacts from our opinion, but the primary driver is, of course, helping to restore this amazing resource that we lost when we built Glen Canyon Dam. Also, a primary driver of this is water storage, implementing water conservation measures and helping people to understand that we can, use less water and be better at storing and managing the resource. So putting all the water downstream to us is a project that can help meet these goals. And I think it's important people realize that, we're not advocating to like tear down Glen Canyon Dam tomorrow. We just want to start this project now, start studying this project now so we can have a better strategy than just doing nothing, which is what's really been going on for a long time. So beginning this project and looking at what, specifically drilling new bypass tunnels will look like, and letting the flows go down into Grand Canyon and starting to mitigate the damages of the drought. So yeah, basically these are the kind of the major bullet points from Fill Mead First, but all of the like projects that we've done in some way have helped us inform this. And they're not always, science. We call ourselves a science-based advocacy group, but so, not all the science that we've done is exactly great for Fill Mead First. There's always like question marks for, evaporation and seepage rates and water storage and that kind of thing. But for us, they all do lead to this project being the best example for fighting what we would call, the new normal. And in doing so, restoring Glen Canyon. So it's a phased approach. We do this in different steps, which is already kind of happening because of how low the reservoir's gotten. But once again, we just want to start the process now. So instead of just having sediment load back up behind the dam, we figure out a way to start moving it downstream. It adds flexibility and efficiency to the system. So by not tearing the dam down, we actually have a backup just in case we ever would need, we could return to a period where we have a few years of high precipitation rates, which is kind of the wild card with climate change. We could get big flooding years again. And what's better than having a dam to mitigate that versus having two full reservoirs like we saw in '83, where we almost lost the dam. We'd have a place to put some of that water while we managed the amount of runoff coming in. So yeah, there's a lot of, I think, benefits to Fill Mead First, namely being restoring Glen Canyon. So this is kind of a timely thing because, as once again, I'm sure some of you are aware, there's a new operating guidelines that are going to be done in 2026. So we really want to have this Fill Mead First proposal on the table during those meetings. So our big goal for that is to have policymakers taking us like a hard look at more, strategic and kind of big picture goals versus kind of the status quo ways of mitigating this. So some of those, I would say, more status quo things are happening right now, like the DROA, for example, which is the Upper Basin states' drought response plan to mitigate their basically need to fill Lake Powell up with water. So we think that they're not doing enough to address these big questions of climate change, of overallocation. They're just kind of putting a Band-Aid on the issue. The 500 plus plan, which is the Lower Basin states' current project, is a little bit more, I would say, forward in trying to mitigate damages. So they're basically, taking different cuts from users, mandatory cutbacks and voluntary cuts, which is, it's good. It's people realizing they have to use less water. And so we'd like to see that continued and helping to drive this 2026 operating guideline to basically more conservation and environmentally conscious direction. So in the meantime, while all that kind of stuff is happening, drying out of the world and big political moves happening, we are seeing amazing restoration on an unprecedented scale down in Glen Canyon. And it's pretty interesting going down there in the spring when water is at the lowest it gets, although last year it never came up, so it was low all year. But we're walking into some of these canyons that people really haven't explored for decades because there's been a reservoir there. And we're seeing, as you can see from this picture, this is taken in the spring of 2021, willows and cottonwoods coming back to life, native grasses and plants, bugs and birds and frogs kind of living in these riparian corridors. This was taken in the Escalante Arm, which is where a lot of our work is done because it's a pretty easy place to boat down from Bullfrog and see what's going on. What was really shocking this past spring about getting into the Escalante is we boated up into where there used to be, a reservoir for another 10 miles, and only a mile or 2 miles into the Escalante Arm of Lake Powell, we hit the delta. We ran right into this big sandbar, and that's where the Escalante River was free flowing through settled sediment. So that was pretty shocking to see and really cool to explore that landscape and seeing, old houseboat moorings, 150 feet on the side of cliffs dangling there that have, will never really come back to use. And it's a really interesting place to go and hike around and see what's changing. And so these side canyons like Willow, 50 Mile, Clear Creek, Davis Gulch are quickly restoring in the course of just a couple seasons. Really, we've seen water come out, and then what we would expect 20 years of sediment to clear will clear in like 2 flash flood events, and then plant life comes back to life. So it's really cool. We've gone down there with scientists from the USGS and Western Water to go and see what's happening on a both sediment and plant kind of basis, as well as a couple of citizen BioBlitzes. We'll get into that in a second. So yeah, basically, like as far as the numbers go, this is kind of what the amount of exposed river shoreline looks like. Hundreds of thousands of acres of Glen Canyon, basically, which is like currently still kind of Lake Powell shoreline, coming back to life, and then hundreds of miles of riparian areas, so streams, creeks, and these seep springs that were once underwater are all kind of really resilient in how they rebounded. There's also kind of a lot of action happening on the main stem, but primarily our research currently has been in the side canyons, which is part of the reason why our early river runners loved Glen Canyon so much, was these amazing side canyons, and it's really been really cool to see them come back from high water. So this is just these are actually kind of older pictures from 2017 ish, and so even then, there's already places like Iceberg Canyon here, which have come down and then flooded, like will flash out and clear sediment away that were once basically thought lost. So this is Cathedral in the Desert. This is a historical photograph on the left, and then a picture at near full pool, or 2010 would have been, below full pool, but at what we consider, 60 or 70% full at reservoir. So pretty much flooded, like there was no feature there, no geological formation of Cathedral. So it just looks like a reservoir basically. And then here is the spring of 2021 Cathedral in the Desert, looking into the canyon from this kind of like vantage point that we've established. And we, usually we just motorboat right up to this little muddy shore right here and like hang out on this beach next to the waterfall. And that was until, this past summer. And then in October, or really in the middle of the summer this year, we had this flash flood event that, well, first what happened is the water continued to come down. So instead of there being a place to park your boat, we'd have to hike into Cathedral, which we didn't think was going to happen for another 10 years or something, but it happened this summer, which was amazing. So we could hear the waterfall before you got to it. So then we'd hike in, and over the course of the water coming down, there was these floods that hit the desert in the middle of the summer and into the fall. And as you can see, scoured away 30 or 40 feet of sediment that had choked the chamber. And so now the waterfall is almost back to its kind of original size, as you can see, compared to the historical photograph, which is a shocking kind of process to watch happen over the course of 2 years. And pretty cool. Similarly, this is Gregory Bridge, which is another one of these kind of like indicators we're using for understanding how fast stuff is changing. And as you can see on this picture on the right, the bathtub ring is, like 100 feet above the top of the arch. And that's where the reservoir used to be. And, as of this fall, you could run a motorboat under the arch now and ducky through it and get into 50 Mile Canyon, which is similarly one of these like places we've been kind of advocating to watch and see like how it's changing and how these landscapes, are worth protecting, because they are coming back and they are still beautiful, even though they've been underwater for 70 years. So similarly to our kind of recon work in some of the Escalante arms, we actually have done some more standardized kind of boots on the ground work. We did a BioBlitz in 2019 where we brought 20 scientists, expert scientists down 50 Mile to look at a variety of different flora and fauna that are happening down there. restoring down there. And so that's kind of began our next phase of understanding the restoration projects. And so we've started with that, and now we've got a couple researchers interested in coming down with us on trips last year and into this year to continue looking at the change that's happening in the restoration of plants and animals in the area. And you can see just like some of the examples of native species that are coming back. And yeah, here's more information about the BioBlitz. All of these regions were underwater or under choked with sediment. So it was a picture of the subway slot. There was 30 feet of sediment in there and 100 plus feet of water, which is restored. This kind of area with maiden fern that's coming back, and then this waterfall feature. These are all places that we identified as of interest during our BioBlitz, and we're going back to this coming year, and we went back to last year with our current scientists we're working with. Another really amazing project that we've had the opportunity of kind of taking under our wing and collaborating with is the Returning Rapids project. Some of you, if you've spent any time in the Moab area, might have heard of these folks. They've been since 2013 kind of identifying changes happening on the Mainstem below Big Drop 3. The idea came from a film they had watched about glaciers receding. It was called Chasing Ice. And the folks in the film were using different landmarks to identify how landscapes were changing with the glaciers coming receding. But they started using the same kind of methodology, looking at rapids below Big Drop. So back in the 90s, Big Drop 3, pour out over that, and you'd be on Lake Powell. That was the end of the cataract run. But of course, since then, we've had miles, like 35 miles of river come back. So there's all these areas that have been changing pretty drastically. And in that, up to class 3 rapids are returning from under high water. And so that's been really cool for those guys who have just citizen science style for a long time been observing and photo matching. And now they've got a lot of people, some similar folks that we're working with down in the Glen Canyon region, but from USGS and Grand Canyon Monitoring and a couple other, or the University of Utah, a few other, especially geologic groups, researching what's happening with mostly sediment removal, because that's kind of like what brings these areas back from not having rapids. There's sediment that's getting transported downstream, and in doing so, exposing rocks in the river and bringing the rapids back. But there's a lot of really interesting stuff happening. And just from a recreation standpoint, similarly to hiking in Escalante and around Glen Canyon, the hiking and rafting in Lower Cataract now and Upper Glen Canyon is really interesting, because it's just changing every year. It's kind of like we're like, going to the moon every time, like seeing new stuff and understanding just how quickly things are changing. Especially those floods that we saw clear out Cathedral, blasted a lot of sediment out of a couple of the side canyons in Lower Cataract and Upper Glen Canyon, like Clearwater and Dark Canyon, removed some, 30-foot sediment banks that just like flooded out into the main stem. So it's really cool. It's places that other people aren't really looking at with the same eye as, especially the Returning Rapids project folks and Glen Canyon Institute. So it's been pretty exciting to see more people become engaged by these processes and the landscape change happening down there. Oops. And so that's like really our goal with all of this stuff, like all the research that we've done under Phil Mead First and all the current sort of press and collaborative efforts that we've had in the last 2 years. And for the sake of Returning Rapids project, like we want people from government agencies and policymakers to be looking at this landscape not as just a big place to hold water for the upper basin, but as a landscape that is restoring, recovering, and worth protection for a variety of reasons. Culturally significant, naturally significant, beautiful environment, huge significance for recreation. And so we want to showcase all the stuff that's happening, help understand a new way forward, and then allow the Park Service, the USGS, the Bureau of Reclamation to figure out better strategies for managing this landscape. And so that's really the goal here, is to like facilitate new management strategies. And yeah, that's sort of like the primary focus. And I mean, for us, Glen Canyon, would look at would look a lot like Grand Canyon in its management. We'd have some sort of more national park based recreation. We have some places where people could kind of coalesce and look into the canyon. And then we have a lot of backcountry recreation, a lot of rafting and hiking and canyoneering. Of course, we want to have the tribes lead this strategy of management. So understanding how to do it in a way that's very helps them build revenue as well as take care of the place and from their cultural perspective. And yeah, that's sort of the strategy, just like a variety of different management, but basically fighting for the place as a landscape versus a reservoir at this point. So yeah, the coming couple of years, especially up to 2026, is going to be really exciting, because that's when the next phase of law will be written around this landscape and the river. So yeah, I would say in the next 3 years, we have a lot of work to do. We're going to continue our projects with Returning Rapids project with Western Water Association, USGS, and the universities locally and down in Arizona to get experts out in the field and continue looking at some of these restoration processes. Continue our interpretive trips, getting down there and showing people from the public and the media what's happening on the ground. And yeah, it's just keeping the ball rolling. We'd like to take what we've done in Cataract and Escalante and apply it to the San Juan arm and see some of the what's happening in the lower river or lower canyon. Because everywhere in the canyon is kind of changing and on a different scale, depending on how much sediment's there and how long it's been underwater. So each one of these side canyons is unique and kind of needs some attention and some love. So we're going to just keep expanding our work and getting people out in the field to know what's going on out there. Yeah, and this is just kind of a summary of the goal that I've kind of relayed for Film Mead First, and the point of all the research we're doing down there, just to get people in the position to make big changes for the river, to think about Glen Canyon as a landscape as opposed to a reservoir. And yeah, we just want Glen Canyon to be a very key part of new negotiations and planning for the future of the river, as well as understanding our place within the plateau and how we use these resources. Okay, that's the presentation.
Wow, that's really cool. Thanks, Jack, for that. Really appreciate that. It got me really excited. It's definitely all those places that you hear about, they'll never return. Hearing about how they're coming back is super cool and exciting. So thanks for that, Jack. And I just want to remind everybody to submit your questions ahead of time. And also don't forget to join us live February 26th, starting at 9:30 a.m. Jack will be back to answer questions. And I've got a bunch of them, and I'm sure a bunch of people will as well. So looking forward to that. Again, thanks so much, Jack. Really appreciate it.